Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Nuno. Nuno, can you please introduce yourself and share a little bit about your experience and background?
With much pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Gleb. So my name is Nuno Gonçalves. I have been a chief learning officer and a chief talent officer in many different industries and in many different organizations as well. I have been the chief learning officer of a pharmaceutical company called Sanofi, chief talent officer of another biopharma company called UCB. I then joined Mars, an iconic brand in the world, leading their strategic capabilities and the strategy for their corporate university, and more recently with Nike, where I was their VP of talent management and executive development. Right now, I'm advising organizations that want to scale up in a world where, as you know, is changing significantly and at an unprecedented pace as well.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about your experience with distributed work. So there's been a lot of controversy about distributed work. Amazon has called its staff back to the office 5 days a week. Others, let's say Microsoft, has said that we'll keep flexible as long as people are productive, which clearly seems like people at Microsoft are productive. Tell me about your experience with distributed work in your CHRO roles, talent management roles. You, of course, know quite a bit about that.
With pleasure. I've started at Mars in the middle of COVID.
Mhm.
I had moved out of a company called UCB and I started at Mars in the middle of COVID.
Mhm.
For a role that typically would be a role in Washington, D.C., but Mars agreed that given the right person, with the right skills, the right
Mhm.
profile, that they would accept that I would stay in my home country in Portugal, which was the
Mhm.
case. Now, 2 years later, and that was already agreed at that time, they've asked me to join and to come to DC.
Mhm.
I needed and wanted also to learn more from the history, the brand, the people, and have more face-to-face relationships, which I did. That was 1 year out of the 3 years that I was at Mars. My performance, my productivity wasn't lower when I was in Portugal than when I was in the US.
Mhm.
I delivered the same things. I've delivered perhaps even more than when I was in the US.
Mhm.
I then transitioned to Nike. Nike has, and when I started at Nike, Nike was in a hybrid model of 3 days at work and 2 days at home, which then, given all the results, given all the pressures, it went to 4 days in the office, 1 day at home. So my experience has been varied, where with companies that have more acceptance with distributed workforce, in companies that are evolving as they learn. And I believe, and there are some studies right now coming out from Stanford as well, saying that the pressure on results push to for CEOs to actually come back to office and to change and adjust their policy for more days in the office than anything else. The interesting thing is that it doesn't seem, given some of that research in Stanford, that this is actually giving or having a positive effect on their
Mhm.
results. So there's a perception. The reality doesn't seem to follow the perception in any case.
Yeah, it's definitely been the case that research has shown that having forced return to office mandates doesn't really seem to increase productivity and in turn, it causes disengagement and harms retention. So that's kind of what the research is showing. It's kind of interesting that a lot of leaders are pushing people back to the office. Now, from your experience, why do you think you've worked at Nike? They've changed from 3-2 to 4-1. Have you seen that happen? Why are leaders actually pushing for their staff to spend more time in the office, despite the research, the evidence showing that that might not be a good idea from a company perspective of productivity, from a company perspective of employee retention, employee morale, engagement? What do you think?
I was in two very different environments from a financial and business perspective. Mars is a company that is very, very well from a financial business perspective. Had just made an acquisition of over $30 billion this year,
Mm-hmm.
but a company that has more than 100 years of history. The
Mm-hmm.
reality is that the 100 years of history has been very successful and with a model that typically we have a tendency to replicate. When we're successful, we replicate a model and a recipe one way or the other. And the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that at Mars, given the culture, the setup of the organization, it continues to prosper. Now, would it prosper more with more of a distributed workforce or not? I don't know. But the reality is that it seems to be a good fit for that organization so far. Now, if we go to Nike, um, studies show and human psychology shows that when you're feeling pressure, you go back to your default, to what
Mm-hmm.
you know. And there is a perception, maybe on people that have more seniority and more years of experience, which typically are those that are also in leadership and CEOs and leadership teams, that performance equal to face time.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe we need to disprove that. We need to be
Mm-hmm.
able to show the evidence, and it may take a generation or two to be able to do that. From my perspective, the study that I was telling you about from the Professor Nick Bloom at
Mm-hmm.
Stanford, it was very interesting. Early indication says that return to office has no impact on future profit or stock returns. Return to office are more likely after poor historic profits and stock returns, which was the case with Nike. Nike had a huge pressure from a financial perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore it increased more the pressure to come to the office. Are more likely in companies with older male CEOs,
Mm-hmm.
are more likely for companies in large cities with cheap office space. Makes sense. It leads to your point to exit of employees, likely. Interestingly enough, particularly with some more tenured employees that maybe have more conditions to find from a financial perspective to have other choices.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, it reduces employee sentiment. Now, his conclusions is that it's collectively, this appears to be a mix of, it's driven by CEO personal views.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that the majority of the organizations that we have today still have older male CEOs, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's some correlation as well, there as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons why there's a push there. I believe that from a demographic perspective, that we are having CEOs that are seeing it differently. And me
Mm-hmm.
personally, I believe that one, the culture of an organization is one of the most important things that we need to maintain. If it
Mm-hmm.
fits more of a face-to-face, okay. But I believe that extending and being open to all the talent throughout the world in the distributed network and access to all that talent is, for most companies, or will be for most companies, the right route to go.
Excellent. Now, the study that you're talking about, I think one of the interesting aspects of it, something you didn't mention, but I'd like to chat about it, is that the companies that are more likely to go to the office have more stocks owned by private retail, small retail investors, whereas the companies that are less likely to go to the office, controlling for everything else, are owned by large institutional investors. In other words, the stock market of large institutional investors, the studies suggest that they are more sophisticated and they're less likely to believe the claims of the CEO. In other words, they're more likely to go by the data, and they're less likely to believe the claims of the CEO that, hey, the poor market returns that we've been experiencing are due to remote work. And it's easier to convince mom and pop retail investors who are not nearly as sophisticated about these topics. And so, how much of the push to go to the office with these poor financial returns do you think comes from the perceptions that the CEO wants to leave with the broader stock market, especially when most of the stock owners are not sophisticated retail institutions, but small scale mom and pop investors?
Correct. It's a great question. I think that to your point, size, market share, growth do not equal maturity.
Mhm.
So we have a lot of organizations that are multi-billion dollars organizations that are not mature from a cultural and organizational psychology perspective, one way or the other. Where in some cases there's fear, there's no psychological safety, there's a culture that ultimately is not necessarily the most productive culture. So I think it's very interesting to correlate between big shareholders and smaller shareholders. My take is that the pressure of productivity for companies that are not coming out of COVID specifically, that went hybrid and have suffered productivity losses, there's a perception that those productivity losses is connected to the return from to the office, which I don't believe in. So yes, I think there's sophistication or not. I think there's a lot of even big investors that ultimately their biggest focus is productivity. Their biggest focus is economic returns. And yes, and if that means that ultimately there is less employee engagement, they are still very much driven short term. And short term, people still believe, some investors, hopefully not all, and I know not all, that coming to the office is a way to gain productivity and to innovate further. It has been, and I believe is one of the beliefs that has pushed Nike to be able to go to a 4-1 model as well.
And that's definitely, as we talked about, something that the studies are disproving. So, as we think about the future and as we wrap up, what do you think will be the future of distributed work? Where do you see things trending in the next couple of years?
It is very obvious that hybrid is here to stay. All studies, Harvard studies, Stanford studies suggest exactly that. I think that given all I'm very curious to see what will be the impact and what is the impact today of Gen AI in the workforce and how that it will change work. I believe that it will allow us to have and to focus a lot of the productivity also on AI agents or digital workers as well. So I hope that a lot of organizations will focus the productivity there and that they will leave for the humans what is more focused on what humans do best. I am hopeful. This might be also a preference, so I might be biased with my own preferences that we go to a model where we have purposeful meetings, where we have purposeful gatherings, where, as Spotify's CEO says, that where companies treat employees as an adult and ultimately empower those adults to make the decisions of when do we need to be face to face and when we don't. So I believe the evidence will be stronger and stronger. It will be harder to dispute as more use cases that we have that distributed workforce, hybrid workforce seems to be the most profitable, the most performing setup as well. I believe it's a win-win for all, for the talent, for the organizations, because ultimately it provides purposeful connections. It's not because you go to the office every day that you will always engage in purposeful connections, but connections for offsites, connections to talk about to align the teams to be able to have to work in team development, to work in team conflict, to work all those things that ultimately are the opportunities to build human behavior, to steer human behavior, to build alignment. Those are the moments where I think teams need to come together. Otherwise, with great leaders, with leaders that empower, with great professionals, with great technology that we have, I don't see a world where we go back to return to the office as many other organizations are going. More and more a world where, as we maybe a generation, to the point that I was making, where we have younger, more diverse CEOs in the chairs, that ultimately we start building different beliefs and making different choices as well. So that's my belief.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Nuno. This was a really helpful discussion.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and helps us improve the show.